Okay, so welcome to now the interesting sections about the module where we start looking more on the activities of human resources management, particularly narrowing focus. Like last time, we ended in chapter 5 where we were looking at recruitment, selection, and onboarding. This time round, we are paying attention to aspects such as performance management, training and development, compensation, and then we will end by the end of the week with a focus more on managing disputes and labor relations. What I'm also going to do right at the end is we're going to then talk about the case studies. Last week, you remember, we spoke about the assignment. And I hope people have now started the assignment and working on the assignment. And then this week we'll talk about the case studies and maybe the rationale of why we are having case studies as part of this module. So today we're going to look at a very interesting subject and area, which is the issue of performance management, which is becoming a very contentious issue because it's all about creating metrics that allow us to be able to objectively measure aspects related to how people perform. But it's often difficult because different countries have different emphasis on certain aspects of performance management. In Japan, there's a saying that goes, the nail that sticks out shall be hammered in. And basically what that means simply is the emphasis is on conformity, where people must work together in unison and in tandem with each other without one outperforming the other. In other more individualistic contexts, there's emphasis on what we call agency, or the role of the individual and their ability to be able to decide not only how they will work, but at which pace at which they will work. So the emphasis really is not so much on trying to conform with the other, but to really set the standard of how you prefer to perform and how you get individually rewarded based on the effort and the input that you would have put in. Now, it's often marred in conflict because certain factors influence performance. One such factor is the location, that you will find that a post which is based in Johannesburg would actually pay differently to a course that is offered to a job that is offered in East London, because of also the changes and the dynamics that are happening in that particular context. Performance management is also influenced through efforts of the local culture, but also policies in place set aside by the government, and how these encourage the orientation of how the particular firm is supposed to go by virtue of the policies that are in place. So in essence, what we have, ladies and gentlemen, is a very complex animal that is very difficult to measure, and the difficulty is not often made difficult by the virtue of contextual issues, but also the necessity of issues related to fairness. Later on, we'll talk about compensation, where we will talk about what really is classified as a fair wage or fair compensation. And you'll actually see that the two issues related to how people perform are not entirely separated to the issue of how well people are paid. And so this is part and parcel of the focus that we would like to draw your attention to. So performance management, really the root word is to perform, which is really linked to output and how people see measurable and tangible outcomes of the experience of work, and how these subsequently inform and assist in setting up priorities around other aspects related to compensation, training and development, and even opportunities for growth that characterize different people in the environment that we'll be looking at. So it's a very, very hot issue. It's an issue which requires our focus and our attention. It's an issue which should not be taken lightly, and it's an issue really that has characterized much of the debate within labor circles around how people perform. So that being said, we've got our outcomes of what we want to cover. And I always say to you that if you're stuck on what is it that you need to know for this particular section, in addition to reading the book, please hear me out. Do not think that you will pass the module by just studying the slides. Please, 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 I urge you, read the book as well. We're going to discuss the importance of performance management as a key human resources management tool, or as a key human capital management tool. We're also going to describe the different components that constitute the performance management system. Hopefully, we'll show you how to design a performance management system, a task not made easy by challenges that are in the environment that people operate within. I mean, one of the most important challenges that we can talk about here is what's currently happening in the public sector, where we are having a lot of focus on wage negotiations, SAMU, SALGA, negotiating on behalf of their stakeholders. And as the negotiations happen, you will notice the idea of performance management keeps on coming up, and how it shapes even those debates as to what constitutes a fair wage negotiation. We'll then show you how to manage and monitor performance on a continuous basis. And I think the operative word again here is on a continual basis. It's not a once-off event, but it's an event that is ongoing, that is warranted in terms of the necessary debates that are happening within the industry that people are operating within. We also show you how to set performance goals, appraise the performance, and finally conduct a performance appraisal interview. So let's get started by looking first into some key aspects related to performance management, which is really the first part is looking at a range of factors that influence performance management. I'd like us to start by outcomes, which is right here, and we've called them here consequences. But these are really outcomes of what happens if we pay attention to developing aspects related to performance management within the organization. In other circles, you will be aware of challenges related to equal pay by gender, where you actually find males, by virtue of their gender, in some contexts, are actually paid more than their female counterparts. So the outcomes that we're talking about here, and we phrase these as consequences, are really, in an idealistic manner, the things that should be happening when we have sorted out a very thorough, sound performance process. We should be focusing on rewards. In other words, we should be able to pay people for the services that they've put in a way that also not only satisfies the people, as we will show in terms of the compensation chapter, but also in terms of the standard of living and the factors that are within the environment. These are what we call compensable factors. In other words, when you go to work, these are the factors that determine the amount of money that you'll be able to get, your qualifications, your experience, and also contextual issues of where you're coming from. We also look forward to performance management because it assists with regard to training and development efforts. And by this, we simply mean that through paying attention to performance management, we are able then to identify a training and needs gap of what and how we should be training people. If we notice that this is the standard of what's expected, you're a bricklayer or brickmaker, and you're supposed to produce 250 bricks a day, and you are only producing 120 bricks a day. clearly there's a disparity between what is expected and what is actually happening. And so this disparity tells us of what we call a performance gap. And then the performance gap then informs a direction in terms of the type of needs that we ought to satisfy. And in this case, these are the training and development needs. We then can say, based on the performance gap that we have identified, we are then able to say, this is the particular gap, and this is for the person to arrive to a certain performance standard. We need to fill this gap. And when that gap is filled, we're then satisfied to know that we have achieved that which we want to do. Performance management also assists us to be able to plan for the eventuality of new leaders and new talent coming into the workplace, which is this idea of succession planning. Through knowing how people are performing, if people are not performing well, we are able to know whether the person is able to satisfy the need and the desire to be able to meet the organizational direction of in terms of the skill set that we require. Performance management also allows us to be able to know counseling and discipline needs. Counseling part really is any corrective measure of behavior that we then can say, based on the information that we have found about person A, B, C, and D, we can safely conclude that there is a need to be filled, and this need must be filled by allowing this person to have such and such interventions. And when those interventions are introduced, this allows for really some form of corrective measures and corrective behaviors to be put in place. And this therefore also links to when people don't meet the standard and are facing some form of disciplinary inquiry, in addition to the corrective measure of trying to assist the person to be able to meet the standard. In the event of misconduct that may have happened, the performance management review process actually allows us to be able to identify what can be done to correct any anomalies in how the person works. And so all of these that you see in the bottom right-hand corner are the consequences or the outcomes of human resources management. However, in the upper and bottom left corner, we find two important boxes that are there that talk to the inputs of the performance management system. The first of these inputs of the performance management system are known as strategic business objectives. So in other words, these are the objectives that characterize what the organization wants to achieve. These are the objectives, be they short term, medium term, or long term, telling us what we aspire for as an organization. And these are the objectives that kind of set the tone and the direction of where we would like to go. But these objectives are also accompanied by structure. And there's a debate within the literature. Does strategy follow structure? Or does the structure follow the strategy? And depending on how you choose to see it, it can be both ways. But importantly, what we are trying to advocate for here is that at the first stage of understanding the importance of performance management, the organization has at its disposal key information which is used to make a decision around not only the type of performance management intervention to be implemented or the type of performance management policy to be enacted, or even the type of performance management actors to be involved in the process. But really, it's really a holistic parcel and package that allows us to have an input from the organization that sets the tone about what we want to achieve. However, what determines the effect of what we want to achieve is really the organizational structure. The organizational structure is really, if you like, the skeleton through which the body called the organization hinges upon. The organizational structure tells us about the power dynamics within the organization. It tells us about the authority figures, who reports to who, when, and how, and why. It tells us also about the dynamics of even coordination. How is coordination happening? When does it not happen? And how is it supposed and expected to happen? And so the strategic business objectives and the organizational structure become key important input points to the process of organizational performance. In so doing, I would like to take you back to the chapters that we covered earlier on. We then pay attention to some key issues. The job design, which simply means the way in which the jobs are organized or structured. The job profile, remember, the job profile consists of the outcomes and the processes expected around a job. And this includes issues related to staffing. And once you see staffing, you start thinking of the issues related to recruitment, selection, and onboarding. So what we're trying to work with here is really the premise of what is it about the job, what is contained within the job as key useful conduits and important information in helping us to decide that which we want to do. And then in the middle ground, we then have performance monitoring, an agreement. It's important to sign an agreement, and this agreement is signed at an individual level, and it must be accompanied by a review, again at an individual level, with the consequences, therefore, that allow the individual to either flourish, which is your assignment, or to languish. Going further, we then can then say performance management is an important organization-wide intervention that then allows us to be able to propose interventions that allow us to be better. And in allowing us to be better, we pay attention to a range of activities that allow us to be better, or techniques or approaches. The first of these approaches is called the objective setting approach. Objectivity simply means that we are detaching ourselves from any personal bias, and we must put ourselves in a position where we try to control for these personal biases. And we'll talk about that just briefly. We're talking about benchmarking, which is setting the standard against something. And then we can also talk about the balanced scorecard, which is really this idea of weighing in on the importance of performance management through looking at a range of factors and then making sure that we then judge the organization against this range of factors. So let's look at the objective setting approach. This is typified by a very common management practice, which is called MBO, or managing by objectives, which simply means that what we try to do in controlling for any form of biases that exist, we try to make sure that we allow for the setting aside of certain key targets and objectives. And when these key targets and objectives are set, they allow us to be able to then have a unified way of judging everybody across the wide spectrum of people that we have against those objectives or targets. It is seeking to link what we call strategic intent with the day-to-day organizational activity. And this intent is manifest through the goals that we set. It becomes what we call a processual activity or a process activity. In other words, it follows a particular line of thought and pattern of thought. The first of these lines of thought is setting a clear purpose and a vision and a mission. And this allows us to be able to answer the question, what is it that we stand for? What are our values? And how are these values manifest in view of what we want to achieve. We then break down all of this into goals, objectives, and strategy. So the different goals, be they long-term goals, short-term goals, objectives, be they objectives that are framed within certain ideals, such as financial objectives, employee-related objectives, or whatever metric that you choose to suit there in terms of objectives, as long as it suffices to clearly delineate what the objectives are. And then finally, it helps us break into a strategy, which is a plan of action of what we want to achieve. So these goals and objectives and values are then cascaded to the various divisions, sections, and departments of the organization for the sake of not only noting them, but ensuring that they are implemented as part of the organizational renewal process. Management by objective therefore relies on the manager, the employee, and all forms of collaborating partners in the setting up of objectives. So we want everybody, which is a total stakeholder involvement process, everybody should be involved, allowing then the employee to also be part of the process of determining those objectives that are deemed critical in outlining how the employee is to perform. The second one is benchmarking. And as I have said earlier on, this is really setting yourself next to a particular standard. And then the standard then helps you to be able to be aware of whether you are doing well or not. So if you're a company that is operating in Alice or Bisho or East London, what you then do, you take a city or a town with the similar characteristics of where you are staying, and then you say, we're going to use Pietermaritzburg, for instance, and say we are going to benchmark to say, for a company like ours, similar to a company operating in Pietermaritzburg, what makes us to be able to perform better or similarly at the same peg as this company? So the benchmarking exercise is measuring against a standard. Now, you don't want the standard to be too high, especially when you've got challenges. So if you're a small business, you don't want your challenge to be too high and too lofty. At the same time, you don't want your challenge to be too easy. Because when it's too easy, it is therefore then difficult to then say that you are meeting the target, because you could just be berating yourself for success when really there are challenges that are difficult to be able to spot, and which needs really some form of conscientious attention. The third factor, which is another common tool, is known as the balanced scorecard. The balanced scorecard really is measured against 4 facets. So how well we are doing in comparison to others is measured against 4 facets. The first one, and which is most common, is the financial aspect, which then answers the question, how are we doing financially in terms of our performance? The second one is paying attention to the customer. Are we able to meet the needs of our customers? And what feedback are we getting from our customers to be able to satisfy their needs? So you've heard of the saying, the customer is king. So in this case, we put priority on the importance of the customer. And it should be said something here about customers in the contemporary era that we are staying in, especially within aspects of consumer behavior, where customers have rights. You will be aware that we have a new act that seeks to promote the interests of customers, called the Consumer Protection Act. We have new laws that tell us what and what we cannot do with regards to the customers that we are working with. So the customer is an important stakeholder whose needs must be borne into mind as we seek to see how well we are doing in terms of performance in view of the balanced scorecard. The third reason pays more attention away from the macro or external environment to pay attention more on the micro or the internal environment. The focus here is what internal business processes should the organization be good at? And how do we keep both customers and shareholders satisfied with whatever internal business processes that we are working at? And I think it should be mentioned here that what we are saying here is that charity does begin at home. And if charity does begin at home, what we need organizations to pay attention to are the more internal issues happening inside it, as a way of making sure that if we are clean inside, we hope this will translate into some form of action that will help us to have some form of outside benefit. Learning and growth opportunities. How does the organization sustain its ability to develop and improve in certain key areas? And this then gives us focus to what we call the L&D function, which is the learning and development aspect. Growth here is merely put differently, it's an element of development. And our focus is on ensuring the desire and the need for continuous improvement. How do we continue to be better, especially in an environment where we may be challenged not to be better in terms of the dynamics of the challenges that we are facing? I'm currently writing a paper where we are looking at how organizations learn in the period of the pandemic. And what we are noticing there is that never than before, it becomes critical for organizations to continuously invest in dynamic capabilities, as these are important in assisting the organization to leverage or to realize a competitive advantage in how they perform. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have presented to you three main mechanisms at an organizational level of ensuring that performance management happens. The first one is the objective setting approach. The second one is the benchmarking approach. And the third one is the balanced scorecard. The next important question that we then ask is, what then are the steps in the performance management process? What then are the steps in the performance management process? To answer this question, and because it gets a bit confusing, we have put an acronym for the 4 steps by looking at the first letters of each of the steps. So step 1, strategic business objectives. The first letter is there is S. Step number 2, meeting to agree on personal objectives. And the next letter there is an M. Step number 3, assessing performance. And the first letter there is an A. And step number 4, meeting to review the performance. And the first letter there is another M. So the acronym that we usually play around with it there is SMAM. SMAM. And one student, I think 2-3 years ago, said, some men are mad. Not all of them, but some of them. Some men are mad. The strategic business objectives gives us focus onto what is happening inside the organization. Number 2, we meet to agree on personal objectives. This really gets the individual employee to be part of the performance management process. We can even then sign a performance management review as an important tool and benchmark for ensuring we are doing that which we are supposed to be doing. Number 3, we then assess the performance. So we assume that the person is now performed. And how do we assess performance? We can assess performance organizationally by looking at those three things: the objective setting approach, the benchmarking approach, and the balanced scorecard approach. And then finally, we then meet to review the performance. We then say, okay, we have set the performance against a set criteria. We would like to now sit down and say, is this performance satisfactory? And is this performance in line with what we want to achieve? And so the key aspect then is then in assessing the performance, we've got a range of techniques and methods that allow us to be able to assess performance. And these range and techniques and methods emanate from different types of scoring systems. So we can use the example of saying someone is a waiter in a restaurant, and then we're going to use a range of appraisal methods to try and see whether this person is doing their job well or they are not doing their job well. And how do we do that? Well, these are the different types of methods that we use. The first of these methods that we use is known as the objective setting approach. The objective setting approach. And really, this inclines itself to aspects such as management by objectives, where the aim here is making sure we set some objectives, and then we say, for a waiter to be classified as a successful waiter, there are certain objectives that they need to achieve. These are objectives related to cleanliness. These are objectives related to etiquette. These are objectives related to personal conduct. These are objectives related to even financial numeracy and customer relations management. And then we then have those objectives, and then we have all our waiters judged according to those objectives. And we are now appraising them based on those objectives. The second one is called the critical incident technique. Now, this one is interesting because it borrows from aspects related to two things. The first one concerns the most crucial aspects related to the job. A waiter should not break cutlery or glasses or plates or whatever. So the critical incident, therefore, is then minimize damage in terms of plates and cutlery that they are working in. The second thing, which is critical and in the critical incident technique, is measuring the dimension of time in all of this. So you may not break glasses and plates and so forth, but you must be able to complete that which is expected of you in the required time, at the required level, and at the required standard. So the critical incidents technique really relies on also looking at maybe mistakes that are made, and then you focus on those mistakes to say, well, ideally, we do not expect you to make this number of mistakes. A good example here is when you go to a driving test. When you go to a driving test world over, you sit there, and as you sit there, you are asked questions. You start driving, obviously, and you basically start with a balance of 100. And there's a minimum standard that you must attain. Maybe you must not go below 80%. So as you start from driving from point A to point B, you are being measured by looking at the critical incidents, mistakes that you are making, and these then used as feeder to determine whether you are performing right or not. The next set of appraisal methods are comparative rankings. I mean, remember, benchmarking. So in comparative rankings, we're trying to compare you against a certain standard. And this standard can consist of a ranking method. So if I had 3 waiters and we say, waiters, 3 customers are going to walk, or 1 customer is going to walk in here. You must serve the person. at different intervals, and then we will then ask the customer to do a fourth ranking, to do a ranking basically to say, of the three, which one was number one, which one was number two, which one was number three. So what we are measuring you against here is a ranking of saying, in terms of the standard and the objectives of what a waiter should do, which of these ranked much better than the other. The second one that can happen is called the paired comparison ranking, where we then, instead of ranking you against 5, 6, 7, 8 people, we can rank you against another person. So it becomes a paired ranking system where we then look at between the two, which one is the better. And then finally, we have the forced distribution. And forced distribution is really to say, you cannot say neither of the candidates was the best. You are then asked to say, you may not have liked all of the candidates, but which one is better? So make a decision, and our decision is going to be based on what is before us. And then we then make a ranking, which is really a forced ranking based on the selection of candidates before us. Finally, appraisal methods can take the form of behavioral approaches. Behavioral approaches. And behavioral approaches are ways of looking at behaviors as a checklist against which the performance is measured against. So behavioral checklists allow us to be able to say, based on the behaviors of the person, we really feel that they're a competent waiter or waitress. The next one is known as the BARS, or the behaviorally anchored rating scales. We then measure different behaviors according to a range, and then we use that information of the different behaviors to say, okay, the 5 behaviors of a waiter: punctuality, courtesy, etiquette, customer relationship management, and sound financial numeracy. We then measure the behavior of all the participants against those 5 in what we call a bars, which is really a bar graph of some sort against each of the behaviors, to then say, okay, how well then is the performance of a person to be classified a good waiter according to these bars. And then finally, we have the 360-degree feedback mechanism. Really, this 360-degree feedback mechanism works when the appraisal is happening in a team context, where in an organization, an intern gets a chance to work in all the functions: HR, marketing, supply chain, production, finance. And then after they come out of that, they then are subjected to feedback mechanism, which is coming from all of these different functions. And that then becomes a 360-degree feedback mechanism. Yes, they will perform well in certain aspects, and also they will not perform well in other aspects. So the importance really is to look at those aspects which they are strong in and see if we can develop these further, and then to work on those aspects in which they need further guidance and further training within. Going further, we can then ask ourselves the question of performance management is rooted and grounded in the idea of objectives. So, what are these objectives? Or what makes these objectives stand out better than the others? And really, the idea of objectives is really something that has been widely theorized and researched upon, that objectives need to be specific, measurable, acceptable, realistic and reasonable, or what we call SMART, time-bound or deadlined or bounded, clear, flexible, prioritized, and several. And these are the benchmarks of good, successful objectives. And these allow you to be able to get enough information to be able to make a decision about a person. Remember, we spoke about the 360-degree feedback. You are in the middle there. You get feedback from all angles, and the benefit there is you are being told, if you like, holistic information about which you can then make a decision around which suits you the most. And I like this because if an individual, therefore, is trying to develop themselves to be a better person, they realize that these are the areas that they are good at, and these are the areas that they need to develop, and these are the complementary areas that link together that need attention or need strengthening. This was the forced distribution method, where we must group them, whether we like it or not, according to an existing metric. In this case, all of you in this class will either be put as part of the bottom, average, and top performers. Now, the problem here comes across when, if I'm a bad performer and I somewhat make it into average, borderline, it won't bother me. It will actually be something that I'm happy about and I'm proud about. But if I'm a top performer and I'm put right in the average performers table, when I believe I could actually be better, it's something that can actually bother me. So the benefit is really twofold, depending on where you stand on either side of the fence. We then can ask a very important fundamental question. What guidelines should we have when we are giving feedback? And I want to use the example of the waiters that we've been using. So you work as a waiter at restaurant A, B, C, whatever. And then what guidelines should we be aware of in terms of how feedback is given to you? The first one is, let the feedback be specific rather than general. There's nothing that a person would hate than to be told that the feedback is your performance is below standard. Okay, so please tell me, what is the standard and how have I not met the standard? So what we are arguing for here is more specific feedback to assist the person. Number two, your feedback is focused more on behavior rather than the person. Your feedback should focus more on behavior rather than the person. In football terms, we would say, mark the ball and not the man. So when feedback is given, it shouldn't be an attack on the personhood, but it should be an addressing of behavior. And we must separate the person from the behavior. We must take the needs of the receiver and the feedback into account, that they need information holistically, and they need this information to come very in a timely manner, and they need this information to also be assisting in their development. The feedback should be aimed at behavior about which the receiver can do something about. You cannot give feedback such as, for you to be a better person in life, you need to go back to your childhood and sort out issues from your childhood. Now, the person cannot go back to their childhood. So you must find issues that are addressable in terms of the feedback that is being given. The feedback is more effective when it is requested than when it is forced on a person. And forced feedback really is coercion, and it really would not be a nice experience. The sharing of information rather than the giving of advice. So this information, transparent and open, to be able to help the person. The timing of the information is crucial. It must be linked to whatever task that has happened. There's no point in giving areas of development months after the activity or the task has been engaged in. It should contain only the amount of information the receiver can use rather than the amount the evaluator can impart. You must find that which is related to helping the user to become better. It involves what was said or done and how, but not why. It involves what was said or done and how, but not necessarily why. And the why part is open to reflection. This allows the individual to use the why part as a period and as a moment of reflection to allow themselves to be able to do what they are supposed to do. It is checked to ensure there is clear communication. It is transparent to ensure that it is not a hidden process, and it's meant to help everybody. So the next question, remember we started off by saying what are the steps of performance management, and we said some men are mad, specific objectives, managing those objectives through ensuring that we meet with the person, assessing the performance, and also meeting to review the performance. The next critical question is how do we manage poor performance? And this is where it gets confusing. Please note, there is a difference between the steps of the performance management process and the steps of managing poor performance. These are the steps of managing poor performance. We first must agree that there's a problem. And this is really trying to take ownership and accountability to the challenge and saying, let's be accountable, we've got a problem. We then explore and identify the reasons to the problem. What is causing this person to act the way that they are acting? We then agree on corrective action. What can we do to make sure that there is some form of corrective behavior or mechanisms to the actions that we are witnessing? We then implement these corrective actions. The person must go for counseling. The person must go on a diversity sensitivity course. The person must be engaged in some form of therapy. We then implement this corrective action and support it. And then we monitor the progress to say, is the poor performance being managed? Please note again, there is a difference between the steps in the performance management process and the steps in managing poor performance. And finally, the steps in counseling employees for performance. We identify and explore the problem. We understand the nature of the problem. We then are engaged in the process of action planning. We then manage the problem. And then when we manage the problem, hopefully we provide and monitoring in terms of making sure that the performance is taken care of. We then offer you some tips on managing issues related to HIV and AIDS and alcoholism in the workplace, which you can have a read at. So, ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, we have tried to cover an important aspect related to performance, which is critical, particularly in the contemporary organizational space, which is necessary also in making sure that we allow people and the staff that work for us to be not only conscientious of the range of challenges that are before them, but to be able to have solutions that allow them to find meaning and also solutions to challenges that are practical, while at the same time seeking to improve people for the better. And that's what performance management is all about, finding expression and outlets in seeking to improve and change the behaviors of people. I don't know if there are any questions just for this component where we've covered before we move into the next segment. Any questions anybody would like to ask? So remember those three things steps of the performance management process, steps in managing for poor performance, and counseling for performance related issues. And trust you me, every year people end up confusing them because they are somewhat confusing. The main one that we like to dwell upon are the steps of the performance management process. Any questions related to what we've covered before we now shift attention to the second part of what we're going to talk about? Okay, so
no question as yet, sir.
No question. Thank you. Thank you.